Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Where Does Nutrition Fit in the Sustainability Equation? Today's Dietitian is the only independent magazine written specifically for registered dietitians and nutrition professionals. We are proud to be the recognized resource for practical, reliable, and interesting information for dietetics professionals. Before we start the presentation, I have 2 points of housekeeping. First, in order to claim your CPE credit, you will have to remain with us through the entire hour-long presentation. Second, at the end of the session, our presenter will be taking questions. If you have a question, please type it in the question box in your control panel, and we will try to address as many questions as time allows. This complimentary 1-credit continuing education webinar is brought to you with support from the National Honey Board. Please note that the National Honey Board provided financial support only and did not have input into the information provided in this course. Today's presenter has the following relevant disclosures to report. She is a consultant with FLM Harvest Board of Advisors, the Context Network, and JG Consulting Services. She is a shareholder in RH Smith Family Farms and Edge Farms. She receives material support from General Mills, Animal Ag Alliance, Nutrition Today, Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, Nutrition Speakers Bureau, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and New York Beef Council. She certifies that no conflict of interest exists for this program. Marianne Smith Edge, MS, RD, LD, FADA, FAND, is founder and principal of the Agri-Nutrition Edge, a strategic marketing and communications consultancy for food and agriculture, food value chain to better understand and navigate the changing consumer environment through strategic positioning and communications. Marianne is a 6th-generation farm owner and produces the bi-monthly Meet Me at the Table blog and the Agri-Nutrition Edge report newsletter. Prior to founding the Agri-Nutrition Edge, Marianne served as Senior Vice President, Nutrition and Food Safety Communications for the International Food Information Council, or IFIC, in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining IFIC, she was the owner of MSE and Associates LLC, providing strategic nutrition and food service consulting services for the food and healthcare industry. Marianne is a former president of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and a member of the Institute for Food Technologists and the American Society for Nutrition. She is co-author of over 25 peer-reviewed publications and a member of the board of editors of Nutrition Today. Marianne served 2 terms on the USDA National Research, Extension, Education, and Economics Advisory Board, the advisory board to the Secretary of Agriculture. She currently serves on the Foundation for Healthy Kentucky Board. She holds a Bachelor of Science degree in dietetics from the University of Kentucky, where she was a former member of the Board of Trustees. She has a master's degree in public health nutrition from Western Kentucky University and earned a certification in appreciative inquiry from the Weatherhead School of Management, Case Western Reserve University. And so with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Marianne Smith Edge.
Thank you, Jack, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to present today on one of my favorite subjects. I'm talking about where nutrition fits in the sustainability equation. As all of you know by your presence today, you have a real interest in sustainability, and it is definitely a hot topic. When we talk about the subject of sustainability, it is complex, and it does span across all sectors of our life. In fact, sustainability is the core of our existence, and nutrition is the core of sustainability. So how does it fit into the equation is what we will explore today. My goal today is to provide you with some insights and overviews based on current practices in science for us to be able to think critically as we talk about the sustainability measures and subject across the food value system. As the learning objectives note, we will identify some commonalities and differences of how sustainability is viewed throughout the food value chain, compare and contrast current research modeling studies related to outcome on human environmental health, and most importantly, really look at assessing what our opportunities are as nutritional professionals to enhance nutrition within the sustainability system. As many of you know, and probably are actively involved, is that with the UN Food System Summit is fast approaching, which will be held in New York in September this year. And with that, the time is now to address how are we going to feed more people? And it's not just feeding more people, it's how are we going to feed more people from a nutritional standpoint with less resources, less land, less water. As you've seen the predictions, it's predicted that by 2050, we'll have 2.2 more billion individuals, approximately 10 million. But just recently, I heard a food futurist said it's not about the next 29 years that we need to be concerned about. It really is the next 9 years that the biggest growth will happen between now and 2030. And of course, you've seen some recent numbers that say in many cases population growth is flat. But we know that across the global system, we will have population growth. And so as the Barilla Center for Nutrition has summarized so appropriately for all of us, is now the time, it's the call to action to think about how we can revolutionize, recreate, or reinvent how we think about food, nutrition, and health, and create that resilient food system that is regenerative, restorative, but most of all is healthier for people and the world around us. So I always like to start saying that even though sustainability may not be hasn't been in our vocabulary for a long period of time, it really is not a 21st century concept. From that agrarian point of view, I'd like to say that agriculture has been about sustainability. And to share a little historical perspective, that picture that you see on the screen, the man behind the horse is my grandfather, and the man standing, or young man at that point on the left-hand side, is my father. And this was probably right around 40 in 1940, early 40s. And so, as you can see, that small farm, and it really was the beginning, because it was about, even then, about thinking about how do we preserve natural resources, because I'm happy to say that that farm is still with us in existence and production today. But really, we haven't really talked about how to fast forward that until about 40 years ago. I have to pause and think when I look at 1980s, I was like, oh, that's not too long ago. And then it's like, no, 1980s is definitely almost 40 years ago. But that is really when I give credit to a nutrition pioneer by the name of Dr. Joan Gothal, who was really the early supporter of linking nutrition and the food supply, and talking about how ag needed to make sure they produced food in a way that preserved the land and the natural resources, and really started to talking about sustainable diets, even though that didn't stick until later. Simultaneously, around 1980s, is when the business world started recognizing that there was a real need to grow economies without destroying the environment or future generations. Hence the concept of the triple bottom line, or the three-legged stool, of which is frequently referenced. In other words, when we really talk about sustainability, sometimes you hear only talking about environment or social, but the reality, and as outlined here from USDA, a sustainable food system really needs to meet the objectives of all three pillars, that sweet spot where they intersect with people, planet, and profits, or the economics. In other words, an objective here, as we see, is really about how do we provide safe and nutritious food in a way that is not only accessible and economically viable for those who are buying, but also it's economically viable for those who produce it, and at the same time preserves natural resources for current and future generations. So how did we begin the convergence of talking about diet and and production, planet and human health. And some of you may have a different historical perspective, but I'd like to at least go back and say that probably the real sustainable diets and perhaps some of the biggest discussions on starting to marry the two may have occurred in 2010. And it does seem that 2010, even though sustainable practices were going on prior to that time, as noted by the 80s, but really bringing this health and environment together was at the FAO summit of the United Nations in 2010. And Tim Lang, he may not know it, I've quoted him quite a bit over the years, but I really like what was written is that, as he said, so what is a good diet for the 21st century? Nutrition science tried throughout the 20th century to clarify what a good diet is for human health, but today has little or nothing to say how we marry human and ecosystems health. Here lies our challenge for the 21st century, which is so true. So as we moved from 2010, we realized that with this definitely burden, but also knowing that how are we going to feed more people and with less resources, we have to get serious about developing sustainability practices. And so in 2015, the UN developed the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which have essentially have become the guidance for the food value chain, with especially focus on Goal 2 of zero hunger. So I think we need to look here is that for some of you, you may work with these every day and those are your guiding principles. Others, you've seen them, especially in some of the discussion around the food system summit. But I think it's interesting if we look at these into perspective, is that really the interconnectedness of focusing on solutions to address the first 4 SDGs, no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, and quality education, really then will help us achieve the next 13 established goals. So when you look at zero hunger, no poverty, health and well-being, obviously tremendous ambitious goals, but the reality is it gives us a pathway for all of us across the food value system from which to create our framework. And frankly, that has been the framework for the food value chain, from agriculture all the way to growers, to CPG companies, and to retail. As many of you know, and you may work in those areas, is that sustainability is definitely a major metric from which success is definitely monitored, but also investors and consumers monitor as well. And basically, their loyalty or their investment is based on company sustainability goals. But the goal is really about making sure that we have the metrics from which to really measure what are we doing. I remember back in probably 2008 or 9 attending a session really kind of talking about sustainability and developing measures and so forth. And the goal was you cannot say that you're going to improve systems without having metrics to validate and show improvement. Otherwise, it's greenwashing. And I think the good news is that over the years, research and the ability to measure and evaluate what's being done, the improvement of metrics and some of the studies I'll talk about, has really helped put some teeth, so to speak, into really assuring that sustainability is not just something we're talking about, it really is about what we're doing. And it's not an option, it has to be done. So really today, sustainability is the conversation across the food value chain. Regardless of where we are, it's part of the conversation, and the focus may be different. For CPG companies, many times it's looking at some of the environmental impacts because, after all, that influences how products are grown and definitely contributes to the overall product development. Commodity groups from soy to dairy are really looking at some of these from water quality, air quality, especially land use, and habitat and economic performance, knowing that how that is going to impart and contribute to overall nutrition and health and wellness. And especially as us as dietitians and working, some may work in and we might be working in retail with some CPG companies or in communities. Part of this is really pulling this into also from the health and wellness and the food waste, of which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. I included this slide strictly as just an FYI concept to understand that from an agriculture perspective, the field to market has become an alliance for sustainable agriculture, that really incorporates a broad collaborative group from agriculture and food companies and retail. And this diverse collaboration group over the past years has been really advantageous in being able to put some of those metrics to measure what the different innovations and practices have done to improve the sustainability of basically growing food. I think if you're not working in the field, you may not recognize that such an entity like this exists. And I would encourage you to look at their website. As one time when I was talking to the CEO several years ago, they said, you know, we've kind of been behind the scenes and not necessarily out, because our goal is to really work not only from direct farmers, but also work across the ag and food value to really look at tools and metrics to be able to measure improvement. What's interesting, some of their recent reports have shown that improvements have been shown in land use, soil conservation, irrigation and water use, energy, and greenhouse emissions for 9 of the major 10 commodities. So this is really impactful because we need to have these type of metrics to be able to really look at, to impart and to be able to have more accurate modeling studies, of which I'll mention shortly. So when we talk about feeding a world, and it really is in a lot of things we read about on looking at agriculture production, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, and really looking at some of the metrics, is that how do we feed that hungry world? And from a U.S. standpoint, I think sometimes when we look at global metrics, we need to really make sure that we understand the difference between global and U.S. or centric metrics. Because as a whole, the U.S. is the most advanced and actually can feed the most and advanced in technology and research, even though others. When we put it all together in global metrics, you know, we're talking across a wide span, and some are more efficient than others. But just to give you an example on efficiency, and some view this as positive, others may question, but a U.S. farmer today can supply food for more than 166 people worldwide, compared with only 26 people in 1960. So you can imagine when you saw the picture of my father and grandfather in the early 40s, is that yes, they provided food. They ran a dairy back then, so it was a small dairy, and it was definitely the milk was shipped, but the amount of milk was probably for a rather small population than what today. But the key here is that with the advancement of understanding of doing more with less, we do use less land every year to produce more food, and we have to. Because frankly, if you think about it, if you heard the term urban sprawl, and that would be the same thing as urban expansion, is that in some of the areas, and in fact, where you see lovely homes that are always outside of a city limit, you can guarantee that they are built on farmland previously. I know I hail from the northern part of Kentucky near Cincinnati, Ohio, and that definitely has happened in that area where, and it will be interesting because now we see where people were coming into the cities, and after COVID, we're seeing that more people are wanting to spread their wings and be again. So it'll be interesting to see if we encounter this urban sprawl. I included on this slide just briefly just to show you an example of kind of the comparison of two crops, corn and beef, to show that how the production methods have basically less beef, less dairy when we talk about livestock, and that produce more than years ago, and the same way with production of whether it's corn or other more vegetable products. So before we get started, I'm just going to give you a quick, and I included some sustainable agriculture terminology, because these are what you see a lot of times when you look at modeling studies. And not to go into a lot of detail, mindful of the time, but when we look at biodiversity, of course, that's always been a topic of conversation. When we think about are we only growing one crop? How do we incorporate more diversity to ensure soil health and kind of the overall diversity and growth of the agricultural land? And that is definitely a topic of conversation. Carbon footprint and carbon sequestration, again, footprint is really representative of the entire human activities that we have on the climate in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases that are produced by plants, animals, us, and all our daily activity. And carbon sequestration is really, when we talk about it, is how does the preservation of forests and also cover crops and even livestock can improve carbon sequestration. And so these are topics that we definitely talk about. But the two that I just want to focus a little bit more on that you hear is one, regenerative agriculture has really popped into the conversation over the last few years. For some CPG companies are even saying they're moving away from using the term sustainability to regenerative agriculture and working with their farmers that grow their top products on really looking about creating that holistic principle-based approach to farming and ranching. Now, what that means is basically looking at full circle. And what I find interesting is is if you've heard of, it's developing like cover crops and no-till, practices that are going to improve soil health. It also includes, in many cases, livestock, because in grazing in areas where nothing else could be grown, but it also preserves that grazing pasture land, and of course with animals providing natural fertilizer back into the soil. It is a holistic approach, but I would say that some of the practices, such as no-till, I can just say personally, my father did actually was an early adopter of some of these back in the late 70s and early 80s. But it's really looking at the full approach. And then the life cycle assessment, it's important for us to understand that this is actually some of the metrics that's used when really looking at the overall modeling studies. This is basically looking at inputs as well as outputs along a product's life or process. For example, is 2005, Walmart was probably one of the first big companies to really start identifying sustainable goals and really looking at life cycle assessments. The dairy industry in 2008 started really looking at the life cycle assessment of a gallon of milk. And so it's looking at inputs along the way. I had a dietitian once ask me, well, what if we just put life cycle assessments on every product? It would make it much easier to be able to identify what was the most sustainable product. And that is true. But what we have to recognize, there are always points in time. And obviously, even a life cycle on, let's say, a gallon of milk could alter because every production from the farm side might be a little different, even though across, once it's in a processor to retail, might be the same. I also say that, you know, every avocado wouldn't have the same life cycle assessment. If one was grown in California and Mexico, it would be definitely a little different. So when we really talk about merging and marrying agriculture and food systems, I think the key is that we're also seeing on both throughout is that it's not anymore just about producing food. It really is about the expectations of nourishing and sustaining. In other words, you know, one of the aspects is Erin Fitzgerald, who's now the CEO of the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Association, wrote in one of her, an essay that was published a couple of years ago, is that it will require all actors in the food systems, from farmers to food manufacturers, to be stewards of the land, along with commitments to sustainable nutrition and climate change, if we truly are going to have sustainable agriculture. So building on that, it then brings us back into this identification of sustainable diets. And as I said, it's really from that 2010 FAO conversation that sustainable diet concept and terminology was more formalized and actually has been the basis of policy over the years. In other words, it's looking at being respectful of the environment, the natural resources. It must be culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair, affordable, as you see, nutritionally adequate and healthy, while still preserving the environment. Dr. Adam Dranowski from the University of Washington actually simplified it more from in around 2018, or that's some of the publications, probably 2016, that really talked about that there are 4 domains of a sustainable diet. And I think this is important for us to kind of think about as we move forward and think about how we can be involved in looking at this on a broad aspect. To be sustainable, food and food patterns need to be nutrient-rich, again, affordable, culturally acceptable, and sparing of natural resources. So the approach to really quantifying specific dietary patterns associated with human and planet health often involves what we call modeling techniques to really evaluate specific dietary patterns and the potential related environmental impacts. The thing about it here is just some of the metrics that I talked about is that it's not always concrete. It's an ever-evolving metrics and movement. So we have to recognize that modeling studies in general, they are an emerging science compared to for what we might know as a randomized controlled trial. And as just discussed, as we improve on how to measure sustainability, then we'll have better data to actually generate better models. What I think is important to, when we look at modeling studies and think about what is the purpose of it, I really like overall thinking about, as it's identified here, is that a good prospective model is not to forecast the exact future, but it shows us the possibilities and provides insights to a more sustainable pathway. And so I think that's important to realize, is that by identifying where there are ways to improve, it gives us, it's a continuous improvement rather than an absolute. So when we talk about, there's a lot of times a lot of discussion, sometimes some heated discussions on really looking at sustainable diet patterns. Is it about planet or personal health? So I just really have very briefly identified, when we look at modeling studies, how they can range from evaluation, and saying that, again, is that we have to recognize whatever food pattern, there's always trade-offs, and there's always some environmental impact. So, for example, this is just a snapshot of a preponderance of science that's out there. In fact, in the last probably 3 days, I've seen some additional studies or other studies that I was like, oh, I should have put these in. But this just gives you a quick example. Is that, for one, some studies have said, well, if we eliminated all animal-based protein in U.S. diets, wouldn't we just reduce greenhouse gas emissions completely? And some show no, it would actually only be about a 3% reduction, but there would be over a 20% increase for food production for plant-based diets. After the 2015 Dietary Guidelines were released, and after the lively discussion of having sustainability parameters in there or not, which were not, is that researchers then looked at what would be the environmental impacts of the Dietary Guidelines food patterns. And what we see here, not surprisingly, that the vegetarian pattern definitely had lower burdens than both the U.S. and the Mediterranean patterns. But they had the greatest reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but there was a increase of land and water usage. From a global perspective, there has been the Eat Lancet diet, and research was released in 2019. And obviously, considerable amount of research and modeling studies had been done to help formulate some of the recommendations and conclusions. But I think from a global perspective, and this gives us that it's not just one solution, is that yes, in their planetary diet, definitely recommendation of a much higher plant base to red meat. But the other talked about, it really is a combination of also modern agriculture technology adoption as well as food waste reduction. So when we think about modeling studies, what's interesting, and much discussion has been around these in the last little bit, is really thinking about that they don't always integrate the contributions of nutrients from macro and micro to human health. In fact, I've just seen some recently, maybe looking for it or just seemed to pop up, is that looking at plant-based and animal-based, to really looking at the contributions of nutrients, not only protein, but also micronutrients to human health. Dranowski has said over the years is that perhaps for accuracy of environmental impact, the comparisons of animal-based and plant-based diets really need to focus on outcomes and quantifiable dietary terms, such as per 100 calories, actually per 100 grams. So the reality from all researchers say, though, that sustainable nutrition does require the integration of economic and social outcomes along with human health and environment. So this quick snapshot here before we move on just says that when we really look at these modeling studies, is that I would hope that it not only gives us some insights, but also helps us to continue to ask the question, what do we need to do better? Both not only from the metrics, but also the outcomes. A couple of models when we talk about nourishing and sustaining is this is the double pyramid that, again, basically illustrates somewhat what the planetary health diet is when saying less animal protein is viewed as more positive to the environmental outputs. And so again, some variances. But what I would say is really when we really look at the convergence of sustainability and health, as I mentioned, there's really no single solution to address food sustainability without trade-offs. We have to look at if it helps one, where's the other, and also put nutrition benefits within. I briefly will just touch a little bit when I talk about knowledge gap or confirmation bias. I think we all talk about sustainability, and many times the conundrum of what we say and we do exists. And does it exist because what we do is because of our lack of clear understanding and from a consumer perspective as well, or our own personal beliefs and perceptions. You know, confirmation bias basically would be what Aristotle says. It's the mark of us educated minds to be able to entertain a thought, but perhaps not accept it just based on our own presence. So when we look at quickly, and I'll show some IFIC data here, is really talking about how environmental sustainability or sustainability plays into purchasing behaviors. We know that we can see here this annual food and health survey from IFIC is that environmental sustainability, the importance, about 30% say it's important, but the reality is some of it, which rightfully so, when we look at it, what are the most important indicators? And some of the highest percentage say recycled packaging or sustainably sourced labels, not necessarily how food is grown per se. But we do see here is that actually determining if food choices are sustainable is difficult. And as some would say, if they were more informed, it would influence. What's interesting is that FDA has a guideline that says if you put sustainably sourced or raised on a label, you must have a website or a practice listed, but it's not a rule. So it leaves a little bit to interpretation. So for many consumers, it's about, I think more and more of us, we are recognizing is that with looking at climate change, and this is from some a study, a consumer study a couple of years ago, is that there is a higher concern now among all of us about climate change, and about what I eat and how it grows, how it affects. But I think we also have to look at that climate change is also how it affects what we do have to eat. So it is complex. But our ultimate goal as nutrition professionals and across the board in the food value chain is really about how can we end hunger, not creating so much elitism between the haves and have-nots. What's interesting, where we are looking at a population where we probably overconsumed at times animal protein, there's other populations who are just coming into having economic means to actually include animal protein. So perhaps it's, again, we look at who should eat more and who should eat less. But we have a great opportunity to balance nutrition in the equation. Some of you probably have read or are very familiar with the Journal of Nutrition and Dietetics article that was written by a group of authors, but spearheaded by Maria Spiker, that really talked about how do we position nutrition in sustainable food systems. And it really starts with all of us around the virtual table today. And looking at these 5 entry points, I really want to focus on a couple of these, which I think a lot of times I will almost call them low-hanging fruit. Because even though the 2025 Dietary Guidelines for Americans do not have technically sustainability guidelines, if you really take a look at it, they are the starting point for achieving sustainable eating habits. Because, as we know, is that a recent study that was published in Appetite journal talked about that, which just reinforced what we see in the Healthy Eating Index as well as in Haines data, is that the current consumer consumption patterns have a much higher percentage of intake of red and processed meats and starchy vegetables, where fruits and vegetables, legumes, nuts and fish are below. So if we look at these basic guidelines as a starting point to actually shift dietary patterns, we can make a big difference not only in nutritional health, but also environmental health. Because as we know, it is a plant-rich with animal protein combination. And so we really want to look at how do we move our consumers and clients to thinking about consuming nutrient-rich foods, but the big thing, consuming them within appropriate portion size, I think this is a great example, and this was from IFIC Food and Health data about three or 4 years ago, that really talked about a typical, again, asking the consumers to identify what they thought their plate looked like versus what the My Plate. And again, as you can see, a much higher percentage in animal protein and definitely lower in fruits and vegetables. So just think what we could do on shifting just the plate rather than thinking about shifting something off the plate or on the plate, is by shifting it, we make some great impact from a human and planet health sustainability aspect. But one of the biggest ones where we can make the biggest difference, and I challenge all of us, I think as nutritional professionals, we need to do more about really focusing on reducing food waste. Think about, we are with individuals every day. We talk about food production, we talk about menus. How much do we talk about preparation? But how much do we talk about how not to waste food and how to preserve it? When you really think about it, 30 to 40% of food produced is waste. That is a number that we keep talking about, but we haven't seemed to be able to reduce it. Not only in our own kitchens, but if we think about it and we can say, oh, but look at the fruits and vegetables or some of the produce that is left in the fields. Unfortunately, at times, some of that's left there because we as consumers want perfect product. And if that's the case, is then the retail market will not pick it. If you've ever grown a garden, and I'm sure many of you have, you don't get perfect product every time. In fact, it really pained me at the local farmers market here a couple of weeks ago, is where a small farmer here producing beautiful salad greens said, oh, I'm reducing the price on this because there's a little burned edge around it, but the quality, it doesn't hurt the quality. And I said to her, of course it doesn't hurt the quality, and you shouldn't have to do that. And so we have to think about, we know that there are misfits and different groups that are working to help basically save some of that and be able to, but we really need to think about how we can incorporate the whole food waste message on preservation and only buying what we need and so forth. Because here, that's what the reality is. When we talk about greenhouse gas emission, if food waste and loss was its own country, as you can see, it's the third largest global emitter behind China and the US. And the reality, when we still have 1 out of 6 people hungry, and we know food insecurity is even bigger than ever. So we need to talk about how we can actually bring those two together. And finally, we need to focus on solutions. You know, as I mentioned at the beginning, the UN Food Systems Summit is in September, and since late fall, there's been lots of conferences, there's been dialogues, there's been conversations, and many of you may have been actively engaged and involved. But I encourage that we all listen, share, and act to understand what each player and actor across the food value chain is doing and how they're doing and what can be done. because we need to understand, again, from where they've come, to understand how we can work together to create a system. Yes, I think we all can be food systems heroes, not only by joining the global movement here for safe and accessible and sustainable food, but by joining the local and the regionals as well to really work together on how we can look at bringing safe and most of all, affordable and accessible and culturally appropriate food to those around us. So what I'd like to say is kind of think about, in this whole sustainability discussion, how can we definitely move conflict to collaboration? You know, when in improv, when you say yes, but, it basically means no inclusion. But if you say yes, and this is just an example, not necessarily yes, and you have to add a combination of protein, but it's the whole conversation. Yes, I understand you, and how can we work together is what is most important as we move forward. So my final food for thought here is that really thinking about balancing nutrition along the journey does require the intersection of economics, of the environment, and the social well-being, which is really you and I working together on social well-being of how we can work together and improve the overall health status of our populations across the globe to ultimately improve our quality of life. I think this is so appropriate, as Fred Kirschman said here. Sustainability is a process. It's not a prescription. It's a journey that we embark upon together. It's not a formula on which we agree. So as I finish and open up for questions, I want to leave you with one quote that I found a few years ago. Alicia Knoll wrote in a book, FADA. She says, there's an old and very wise Native American saying that says that every time you point a finger in scorn, there are three pointing back at you. And so with that, I'd say, how can the fingers pointing back at us motivate us to how we work together to really build a sustainable system, making sure that nutrition becomes a key entity as we look at creating that sustainable diet platform that leaves no one behind. So thank you all very much, and I'll look forward to any questions. Jack?
Thank you, Marianne. That was really fascinating. We do have quite a few questions in the box, so why don't I hop in and get started with them. This came in from a few people, and it's pretty consistent with some of the questions that we've been getting in other sessions. But how do you feel that the COVID pandemic has changed or will change the discussion or impact of sustainability going forward? There was one instance in one of the questions that suggested that maybe urban sprawl will decrease with work from home changes.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Do I think it may decrease? I'm not sure. I'm almost concerned that it might increase because I've seen individuals leave the city, so to speak, if they know that they can work anywhere. And that's not a bad thing. It even could be positive if coming back into smaller regional cities to, build economies. It's just as if it's a sprawl where going out and building on land that would originally be producing food, then that definitely can become a challenge. So we still see that farmland, there's a high amount of farmland that's disappearing, on a daily basis. So I think that's a way to be seen, because probably depending on who we talk to, we get different answers.
That's good, and that's a great answer, because I think I asked the question fairly inartfully. Here's another that in some groupings, people are asking, are there any takeaway points or resources that you could suggest for RDs to give their patients to support sustainable practices as consumers?
That's, we can look at actual tools as consumers. I think the key here is really to look at, frankly, it may sound so middle of the road and moderate, but as I said before, some basic guidelines from the Dietary Guidelines is a good start, because it really does, it's a higher plant-based. It does include animal protein, but it talks about portion. And I think it really, that is a very simple way to really start the conversation. The American Society of Nutrition, as well as the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, definitely has different resources from practice groups. I am not familiar with specific client based that might be available. So, I would start with, the basics from USDA. That's pretty, that is a good, that's a good basis, because I think of course, it depends on your clientele, but even getting people to think about what they eat or what they waste, and there are good food waste from USDA. You can go to the food, I think it's food loss and waste, and the Academy does have some things as well, which all plays into that sustainability equation.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions relating to introducing sustainable diets or sustainable practices in continuing care or retirement settings. Do you have any recommendations there, or is it really just a similar approach?
No, I do. Actually, go on and, and Jack, I'll probably come up with 10 more resources after you ask me, after you ask, but go, there are excellent guidelines in that on it's called REFED, REFED, and they have produced, especially kind of on from sustainable practices and looking at kind of the overall food waste. But I have referenced that and haven't pulled up the resources in the immediate future, but they have a whole guide on really talking about on principles, and it does have it across for from healthcare as well. There's also healthy kitchens, healthy lives. The Culinary Institute has done some things with Harvard, that has some guidelines as well. But I do know, and I have accessed the REFED products as well, or the information.
Are there any sustainability considerations relative to processed foods versus fresh foods?
Well, it all depends on, if you were really looking at kind of the whole life cycle, is that, obviously if fresh food was coming from your backyard, the sustainable and the footprint would be very, very low. If fresh is coming from, if I'm on the East Coast and it's coming from the West Coast, or it's coming from, it's exported, and frankly, a lot of our fresh fruits and vegetables are exported, then again, we have if you look at the overall energy cost, and the metrics would be higher than if it was produced originally. From process, I don't have the details. I'm just giving you kind of a practical standpoint. Is that many times, if I was buying a fresh tomato from California, and someone will give me the numbers, but just in practical sense, if I was buying a fresh tomato versus a canned tomato, having seen that operation where the fields are right next to the processing plant, so they're right there, they're processed immediately. And so, it'd be interesting to see, and I'm sure there are comparisons in their metrics. So in that case, a canned tomato may have a lower footprint, so to speak, than something fresh that was shipped, considering that, if there was refrigeration and how much shipping was involved. So I say that it's not a clear answer, but it's probably not on a lot of things, but it's important to kind of put that in consideration when evaluating, the product, and then also at the end point, what's the nutritional benefit to the overall diet.
Thank you. And then there's some curiosity from the audience as to how these changes in, dietary patterns could affect the livelihoods of farmers, ranchers, and food producers. Well,
that's an excellent question, because I think that's what we, if you've read the news, you hear about carbon credits, and the reality is on how this, farmers, could we actually see some profit from doing cover crops and no-till farm. And some are saying, well, we're only going to pay you for practices that you initiate. Well, if someone like my father that was doing no-till he's deceased at this point, but I mean, if someone had been doing a no-till for 20 and 30 years and already producing a very sustainable product, in some categories, they're not going, some guidelines have said they're not going to pay. So, the reality is, just like in the dairy industry, is that the dairy industry has become very sustainable, but to put in methane digesters and so forth costs money. So, and not that it shouldn't, but it is an economic thing. So I think, as nutrition professionals, we need to realize that, yes, economics is very important, because farmers and ranchers want to do the right thing, but there's, just like in any of us, there's always an economic factor in it. And so if they incur cost, is that cost going to be passed on? Sometimes, who's going to pay the cost? Some of the CPG companies are working with farmers and providing some funding to make some changes. And so, when guidelines if it does become a reality, is that somewhere along the line, it's sometimes farmers either have to go big, or if it's too small, and consumer demand. If you live in New York City, you can be a small, because you may have a very niche product that you can be able to use with food service. And of course, the past year, you definitely saw that was an issue. So yes, from the agriculture standpoint, individuals do want to be sustainable, but sometimes the practices, there is an economic cost, and so how do we all share in it? And it can be positive, but it also can definitely, have some negative benefits as well if all of the economic pieces are not put into that whole equation.
Well, we're right at 3 o'clock, so that's probably a great place to wind up. Everyone was asking for your contact information, so I'm making sure that that's on the screen as we wrap up here. But thank you so much, Marianne. It was really a delight to have you here with us and share your expertise this afternoon.
Well, thank you. And I would just say, feel free to go on the website and sign up for a newsletter, and I'll continue to talk about this. We can continue to have the conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you also to the National Honey Board for supporting the Today's Dietitian audience through quality programming like the webinar we just experienced.
Instructions for credit claiming and downloading handouts should be up on your screen. You must complete a brief evaluation of the course in order to claim your credit and download your certificate. Registered dietitians should use code 175 when recording this activity in their professional development portfolio. If you are watching this webinar on our YouTube channel, please log into ce.todaysdietitian.com, click on the Webinars tab, and select this webinar in order to complete it for credit. If you are watching this webinar on our CE Learning Library website, click Next, or return to the course start page and select the evaluation step to complete this webinar for credit.